Jó reggelt, vagy inkább már jó napot kívánok! Tisztelettel és szeretettel köszöntök mindenkit a Nemzeti Közszolgálati Egyetem szervezésében megvalósuló Ludovika Fesztivál szabad egyetemi programjának nyitónapján. A fontos információkat Horváth Orsolya kommunikációs és programigazgató megosztotta önökkel, úgyhogy én is csak megismételni tudom. Tisztelettel kérem a jelenlévőket, hogy amíg az előadó a színpadon tartózkodik, tiszteljük meg azzal, hogy mi is itt maradunk a teremben. Még egy technikai információ, mielőtt miniszterelnök úrnak átadnám a szót. Minden előadás végén, erre majd az előadó jelzést ad, kérdésekre lesz lehetőség. Kollégáim mikrofonnal természetesen segíteni fogják a kérdezőt, úgyhogy figyelmesen hallgassák, arra kérem önöket, az előadásokat, fogalmazzák meg alatta a kérdéseket, hiszen a vendégeink, az előadóink készséggel válaszolnak az önök által feltett kérdésekre. És akkor vágjunk is bele, szabad egyetemi programunk második napjának nyitó előadása, illegális bevándorlás, az ausztrál megoldás címmel. Kérem, fogadják tisztelettel itt a színpadon az előadót, Ausztrália korábbi miniszterelnökét, Tony Abbott urat. Mr. Prime Minister Abbott, the floor is yours.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. It's wonderful to be here in Budapest. I feel very honoured to be speaking to such a young and dynamic audience. I want first of all to tell you a little bit about myself. I'll then talk for about 15 minutes on the topic, and then if there are questions or observations or comments that you'd like to make, obviously the floor is yours. Now, I should have first of all apologised for speaking to you in English. I don't know any words in Hungarian. I spent a bit of time here in Budapest as a visiting fellow of the Danube Institute, but as yet, while I love all my time here, and I think you Hungarians should be so proud of what you've achieved over the last 3 decades, I haven't as yet managed to master too much of your language. But look, I was the Prime Minister of Australia in 2013 to 2015 at a time when Europe was experiencing an illegal migration crisis, and we had a different migration crisis of our own just prior to the one that Europe had in 2015 and subsequently. I was in Parliament for 25 years all up. I was a minister in the Howard government for 11 years before becoming opposition leader and then winning the election in 2013. So very briefly, Australia. Australia, as I'm sure you know, is a country of some 28 million people. We're safely nestled in the southern hemisphere, far away from trouble points, you might think, but it's funny how the world's troubles can reach out even to relatively isolated countries like Australia. We were settled by Britain in 1788. We have had a broadly happy history since then, and I like to say that Australia is a country with an Indigenous heritage. The original Aboriginal inhabitants who were tens of thousands of years undisturbed before the so-called First Fleet arrived in 1788. We have an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation, and an immigrant character, because 99% of Australians are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants. But just because we are an immigrant country does not mean that all immigration from anywhere at every time is always good. In the end, if immigration is happening illegally, if immigration is happening out of the control of the government, it can do damage to the stability and the continuity and the culture of the country, and it certainly can cause enormous political problems and enormous unrest amongst the population. So that's, if you like, the broad background. Our nearest neighbour is, our nearest large neighbour is Indonesia. Java, the vast populous island of Java, is about 200 miles away from Christmas Island, an Australian outpost, which is itself about 400 miles away from the West Australian mainland. It was back in the mid-1970s that Australia first had a problem of illegal migration by boat. You might remember that after the fall of Hanoi in 1975, there was a savage persecution by the new communist rulers of those associated with the former South Vietnamese government. Hundreds of thousands fled the country by boat. Some made their way to Hong Kong, some made their way to Malaysia and Thailand, some kept going to Australia. A few thousand people made it to Australia. In the end, that wave of illegal migration by boat ceased because eventually the Australian government, the American government and other Western governments established a orderly migration program for Vietnamese refugees who had left the country. So that problem was fixed by the beginning of the 1980s. Then, in the early 1990s, it started again. This time, it was people making their way to Malaysia and to Indonesia, mostly from Muslim countries, and then getting on boats in southern Java and heading to Australia. That gradually built up from 2 or 3 boats a year to a couple of dozen boats a year. By the end of the 1990s, some 5,000 or so people had come illegally by boat. Most of them were held in immigration detention. Eventually, through court action, most of them were let into Australia, and eventually they became Australian citizens. The whole thing came to a head in 1999 when John Howard was Prime Minister, and a boat called the Tampa, a Norwegian vessel, picked up a would-be migrant boat carrying some 400 people. As is usual under the laws of the sea, the skipper of the Tampa picked up the people in distress. It was heading for Indonesia, its next port of call, the nearest port of safety. It was effectively hijacked by the 400 plus people that it had picked up. They demanded to be taken to Australia. The skipper turned the boat around, came to Christmas Island. The Australian government refused to give the boat permission to land. Eventually, Australian SAS soldiers secured the boat. We then had an agreement from the Nauruan government that the boat and its passengers could go to Nauru. They'd be offloaded there. They would be kept in a camp, and their applications for refugee status would be processed. Now, that was, if you like, the beginning of the end of that particular wave of illegal migration, because once it became apparent that people coming to Australia by boat would not readily enter the country, they would be kept overseas and their applications processed overseas, there was much less incentive for people to come to Indonesia and to pay the people smugglers the $10,000 or thereabouts typically requested for a passage, an illegal passage to Australia. I want to make 2 points now. The first point I want to make is that the then Howard government was absolutely determined to do everything it reasonably could to stop people coming to Australia illegally by boat. And that's because the Howard government believed that no one who's not already an Australian citizen or who does not have a strong moral claim on Australia's protection has a right to come and to stay. And this is very important, because you cannot protect yourself from illegal migration if you don't have a strong view that you are morally entitled to do so. And so the enemy of effective border protection is that sense quite prevalent amongst numerous academic and elite circles in Western countries, that sense that somehow a relatively rich Western country has no right to say no to people from relatively poor countries demanding access. So that's the first point I want to make at this stage. The second point I want to make at this stage is that all of those people coming to Australia illegally by boat were not directly fleeing conflict. Mostly they were from Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, sometimes Syria. And before they got on a boat in southern Java to come to Australia, they'd passed through many, many countries. And it's my strong view, not one which is officially acknowledged by the UN, but it is my strong view that people who pass through safe countries in pursuit of a better life and a preferred outcome are no longer refugees. They are only legitimately refugees when they are directly fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution. Once they go beyond that, they're simply people in search of a better life. Now, there's nothing wrong with searching for a better life. All of us want a better life, but you lose that moral claim for sanctuary once you go through one or more countries to a destination which is simply preferred because you might have relatives there, you might think it's got better social security, you might prefer the weather, the lifestyle, whatever. Once you've gone beyond the first place of safety, you are no longer, in my view, a genuine refugee. Anyway, so the Howard government stopped the second wave of illegal migration by boat. It did so by A, offshore processing, B, special visa categories that would deny permanent residency to people who arrived illegally by boat, and C, on occasions, apprehending boats mid-ocean and where the boats were sound, sending them back to Java. So they were the three elements in the Howard government's initial stopping of the illegal boats. Now, the Howard government lost office in 2007. A Labor or centre-left government took office. The incoming Prime Minister said that he would maintain the policies against illegal migration of the former government, but he didn't. He closed down the offshore processing camps at Nauru and in PNG. He abolished the special visa categories for people who had come illegally by boat. And obviously, there was certainly no intention to turn boats around at sea because the incoming Labor government took the view that this was against international law. Predictably enough, the boats started again, only this time in vastly greater numbers. First a trickle and eventually almost a flood. Between 2009 and 2013, some 50,000 people came illegally by boat to Australia in some 1,000 separate boats. And given that the couple of 100 miles between Java and Christmas Island is open sea, subject at times to dangerous sea conditions, we estimate that at least 1,000 people died in attempting to get a better life in Australia. In the worst month, July of 2013, no fewer than 5,000 people on 100 boats arrived in a single month. And then the government changed and I became Prime Minister. I restored the Howard position, which was offshore processing, special visas that didn't admit to permanent residency, and third and most importantly, the determination, wherever possible, to turn boats around and send them back. Now, the people smugglers are not fools. They are always evolving their tactics. What they had started to do was to scuttle their boats as soon as an Australian Navy or Customs vessel came into view. And what are you to do? You can't let people drown. You pick people up. You bring them on board where they can be safe. And under the former government, every time that happened, the boats would take them to Christmas Island, and eventually they'd be in Australia, where invariably they would get access, semi-permanent access to our country. They would get the prize they sought, effectively permanent residency and ultimately citizenship of Australia. So how was I going to stop that? Well, there was one organisational thing and one very important practical step that was done differently. The organisational thing was establishing something called Operational Sovereign Borders, a unified command structure under a senior general, because as any of you who have dealt with government know, government is a hydra-headed monster. There's this department, there's that department, there's this service, there's that service, and often the people running the different departments and services don't speak to each other. No one is really in charge. And I thought that on something as important as this, someone had to be in charge. I made it a senior general, and I said that he had authority over all of the various elements and agencies that were dealing with this problem. The bureaucrats, the Navy, the customs officials, the police, all of them. But this was the key. Where the boats were scuttled, instead of taking people on board and bringing them to Christmas Island, we would take them on board, put them in a mothership. The mothership was a communications black hole. No one could use their mobile phone to ring a lawyer. No one could use their mobile phone to ring a journalist or to ring a family member. We would keep them on the mothership until an appropriate time. We would load them onto an unsinkable orange life raft, take the orange life raft to within a mile or so of Indonesian territorial waters with just enough fuel to make it back to Java, say, that's the way, off you go. And that stopped the problem. From early 2014 until this very day, there has not been a successful people smuggling venture to Australia. Over the last 18 months or so, since a further change of government, 1 or 2 fast boats have made it to Australia and unloaded a handful of people. But given that the source and transit countries are most reluctant to see this whole evil people smuggling trade resume, they have accepted swift repatriation of anyone who comes illegally by boat, something that they were never prepared to do prior to 2014. So I've got to tell you that unlike Italy, unlike Spain, unlike France, unlike Greece, unlike Britain, Australia is the one serious country on earth which has recently stopped a serious problem of illegal migration by boat. And we did it by being absolutely certain that it was the right and the moral thing to do, and by being prepared to do the only effective response to illegal migration by boat to send the people back to the place from whence they'd come. And I've got to say that if the countries of Europe individually and collectively are serious about stopping illegal migration by boat, they have to do exactly the same thing. If people are picked up in the Mediterranean, they need to be landed on the shores of Libya. And you might say, well, how? Simple. Naval personnel have rubber duckies. They can take people ashore. You might say, but is that right? And I would say, well, of course it's right, because if it stops the deaths at sea, if it stops an illegal trade, if it stops people going to a place they have no right to go, of course it's right. And then you might say, well, could you get away with it? And I say, well, hang on a minute. Who's in charge of Libya? No one. So who's going to stop you? Literally, who is going to stop you? And if Europe is serious about solving this problem, that is exactly what it's got to do. Now I want to go on to a slightly thornier issue, and this is the issue of the boats going across the English Channel. A much narrower body of water at its narrowest point, and of course France is a serious country with an effective government. There are two things that Britain has to do if it wants to stop the problem of illegal migration by boat. First of all, it's got to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, at least for the purposes of controlling immigration. And second, it's got to be prepared to send illegal boat people back to France, even if it means the Royal Marines doing it at the dead of night, because let's face it, the Royal Marines have landed on the shores of France many times before, and if that's what it takes to fix this problem, that's what they've got to do. Now, the French won't like it, because they would much rather wave their problem through to Britain. And frankly, if the French were serious about stopping this, they would have stopped it a long time ago. And the only way to make them serious about stopping this is to take strong steps to ensure that they literally have no choice. So thank you for listening to me talk about the Australian experience. I want to close with just a couple of further observations though. Australia, as I said, is the one serious country in recent times that stopped a wave of illegal migration by boat. But it's not just illegal migration that's a problem. Legal migration can equally be a problem, and right now it's a much bigger problem in many countries than illegal migration. In the life of the Biden administration in America, something like 11 million people, can you believe that? 11 million people crossed the Rio Grande from Mexico into the United States. Right now in Britain, probably 50,000 people a year are crossing the English Channel, but something like 1 million people are coming legally to Britain, many of them going on to social security of some sort almost as soon as they arrive. In my own country, Australia, we now have legal migration running at something like 500,000 a year. We're adding something like 2% to our population every year through legal migration. Now, most of those people will ultimately become fine Australians. All of those people want to make a better life for themselves, but at that scale, it puts downward pressure on wages, it puts massive upward pressure on housing costs, it strains infrastructure, whether it be physical infrastructure like roads and railways, or social infrastructure like schools and hospitals, puts massive pressure on infrastructure. The problem in my country, Australia, is that effectively the government has subcontracted out control of immigration to educational institutions who've turned foreign students into a cash cow. It's at the heart of their business model, and to businesses which would often rather bring in cheap labour from overseas than pay Australians a decent wage or train people up to do the jobs that are necessary. Now, I think it's vital that immigration be legal immigration, be kept under control. But again, for that to happen, you've got to have the will. And to have the will, you've got to believe two things. Again, that no one has a right to turn up on your doorstep and demand admission just because he or she would like a better life in your country than in their own. And second, and this is critically important, that you have a right as a nation and as a people to keep your culture, a duty to preserve your society, not forever in aspic, but nevertheless substantially, so that you can evolve in your own way and at your own pace rather than be forced to evolve because of an uncontrolled or scarcely controlled wave of outsiders with very different ideas about how they should live. And I'll finish on this note. While Australia is the one Western country recently to successfully control a wave of illegal migration by boat, Hungary is the only European country that recently has controlled a wave of illegal migration by land. Whatever you think of Viktor Orban, and I have a great deal of respect for him, by building a fence in 2015 to stop the hundreds of thousands of people making their way overland from the Middle East into Europe, he demonstrated a strength and a conviction and a pride in country and culture which I've got to say no other European leader has shown. And agree with him or disagree, you've got to admire the fact that he has been successful and unique. And again, absolutely founded on a belief that the culture of Hungary is worth preserving. Not because it's necessarily better than any other culture, but it's unique, and at least for the people of Hungary, it's their best. And if it's their best, if it's your best, don't you have a right to keep it? So thank you very much. Wonderful to be here. Over to you for questions, comments, or observations. Now, we have a roving mic.
Mr. Abbott, I have got a question that's about the opposition of the Australian. When you created that policy about the migration, what was the reaction of your opposition? Were they mostly supportive, or were they more, or they criticized you more about it? Thank you.
Okay, well look, nothing succeeds like success. The best way to win an argument is not to out-argue your opponent, it is to demonstrate in the real world that what your opponent was saying and doing is wrong, doesn't work. So at the time when well, let's go back a bit. When the Howard government was doing a less rigorous version of what I did, the then Labor opposition were very critical, and they tended to say that it was immoral, that turning boats back was immoral, that keeping people in immigration detention was immoral. There were even some people inside the Howard government who were very distressed by the fact that some immigration detainees would hold rooftop protests. Sometimes they sewed their lips together as a way of indicating how outraged they were. I don't think any serious government should allow itself to succumb to moral blackmail. And doing something simply because someone is inflicting self-harm in an attempt to force you to do what you think is wrong, you just can't give in to that. But nevertheless, there was a lot of opposition to what the Howard government did. Kevin Rudd, who became Prime Minister after John Howard, Labor Prime Minister, he had declared in opposition that he wasn't going to change the policies of the Howard government. He'd upset a lot of people inside his own party when he did that. And once he got into office, he actually did change the policies. He basically instructed the Navy to bring people to Australia. He presided over an explosion of illegal migration. Now, I became leader of the opposition. I said, look, we're going to revert to the Howard government's policies. Kevin Rudd said that if we did try to turn back boats to Indonesia, it would cause armed conflict with Indonesia. I said that this is ridiculous. All we're really doing is trying to get the Indonesians to do what they should do themselves, to stamp out people smuggling, but which they're not sufficiently well organised or not sufficiently motivated, given all the other things on their plate to do. When I became Prime Minister, some of my very senior official advisors reiterated this, that it would cause conflict with Indonesia. My response was, well, what do you think would happen if boats were coming illegally from Australia to Indonesia? What would the Indonesian government do? Frankly, it would have machine gunned them. That's what it would have done. Now, we were never going to do anything like that because we're a decent people who don't do inherently evil things. But no self-respecting country can permit what amounts to a peaceful invasion. Anyway, I was absolutely adamant that this was going to happen. Quite early on, I was told by the then Attorney General that there had been official legal advice that we were acting contrary to international law to turn boats around on the open sea, and I said, well, let's get better advice. I don't know how many of you have dealt with lawyers, but you know what lawyers are like. One lawyer will give you this bit of advice, go to a different lawyer, he'll give you that bit of advice. So I said, well, if we don't like the advice we're getting, let's go to different lawyers and get advice which is more accommodating of what the government needs to do. And so once the boats were in fact stopped, the then opposition was forced to very reluctantly accept that we'd got it right, that they'd been wrong. And the current Prime Minister, who was a senior ALP frontbencher, Labor Party frontbencher, for the whole time of my government and my Conservative successors, he was very morally unhappy about the policy, but I've got to say, to his credit, since he's become Prime Minister, he has not in any significant way changed it. Again, you don't win the argument with words, you win the argument with facts. And even people who are appalled by what you are proposing and doing will often reluctantly change their position if it's obvious that what you're doing has worked in a way that nothing else did. Any other questions, comments, or observations? There's one right over there. There's one here.
Thank you for sharing your ideas. I'm ignorant, sorry. Some journalists, some common people state that countries like Italy and Spain, they are not serious about stopping the immigration because the factories and farms want to exploit cheap labors. Do you think that in Australia the rich people are less reckless in exploiting the cheap labor? Thank you.
Well, there's no doubt that many countries, including Australia, have got some issues in their labour market. First of all, we don't have enough young people because rich Western countries tend not to be reproducing themselves. That's problem number one. Problem number two, we have a lot of young people who are very fussy about the jobs that they will do. Job snobs, I once called them. We have generous, some would say over-generous welfare systems that enable people to be unemployed. I mean, there's no unemployment in poor countries. If there's no welfare, there's no unemployment, because if you don't work, you don't eat, to quote St. Paul. So we obviously have unemployment because it's possible to be unemployed given our welfare systems. So yes, there are lots and lots of businesses in countries like Australia, and I'm sure in Italy, Spain and elsewhere, which are very dependent upon the labour of recent migrants, invariably from third world countries. What's the best way forward here? Well, it's not to keep allowing people in to undercut wages and in many cases to evade the law on their way in. The right way forward is A, to try to encourage Australian and Italian and Spanish and other countries' families to have more kids. Greatest vote of confidence you can make in the future is to have kids. I mean, best possible investment in the future is to have children. We need to remember that. So that's one thing. Second thing, I think, is to run much tougher welfare systems so that you cannot be long-term on welfare if there is a job that you could reasonably take. And one of the things that the Howard government did, and at the time I was the relevant minister, it was called work for the dole. If you are under 50 and if you'd been on unemployment benefits for 6 months, we would say, okay, time's up, game's up, you've got to get a job. And if you can't get a job, we'll give you one for 2 days a week. Yeah, it was called work for the dole, and I used to say to people, you will work. Worklessness is not an option. Preferably you will work for a wage, but if not, you'll work for the dole. And I think that sort of thing needs to be rigorously adopted and enforced if things are to improve. But the other problem is, frankly, lazy, greedy employers. If the job is so unappealing that normal people don't want to do it, well, make it more appealing. Either change the conditions or improve the wage. It shouldn't be that hard. And certainly no one should get away with asking people to work impossible hours under impossible conditions, and when people understandably don't want to do so, finding people from very, very poor countries to do it instead. Okay, any further questions, comments? There's one over there. Hand up.
Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful talk, Prime Minister. I want to ask, since you mentioned the Vietnamese refugee wave following the fall of Saigon, not Hanoi, yeah. Sorry to correct you there. I wonder, what can you say about the Vietnamese experience in Australia since then?
Okay, well look, as I say, Australia is an immigrant society, and I think immigration has lent a heroic dimension to our country, because since 1788, people, first from the British Isles, but subsequently from all over the world, have been coming to our country to build a better life for themselves and their kids, and overwhelmingly they've succeeded. First, because Australia is a welcoming country under the rule of law, whereas I reckon we're amongst the least racist and most colourblind countries on earth. Not perfect, but nevertheless very, very, very good. And so the experience of 99.9% of migrants coming to Australia has been a wonderful one. And regardless of people's race, religion, culture, ethnic background, almost all of them who come to Australia do wonderfully well, and certainly the experience of the Vietnamese who came in quite large numbers. I think something like 200,000 Vietnamese people came in the years after the fall of Saigon. Their experience has been overwhelmingly a positive one, and in the 22 election, a woman called Dai Lee, who from memory was herself a boat person as a very young girl. She was a member of my political party, but for all sorts of reasons decided to run for Parliament as an independent. She won the seat against the Labor Party, which is currently the government party, and I'm delighted to say that in her maiden speech to the Australian Parliament, her first speech to the Australian Parliament, Dai Lee stood up in a beautiful, beautiful dress, entirely the Australian flag. And I thought, what greater sign of pride and affirmation in the wonders of Australia to a former Vietnamese boat person than standing up as a member of the Australian Parliament, dressed in the Australian flag, to proclaim your faith